He didn't recognize me. As I sat across from him in the mahogany-clad boardroom of Sterling & Associates, I watched Julian Thorne adjust his silk tie with the same arrogant flick of the wrist I remembered from a decade ago. To him, I was just Mr. Elias Vance, the high-priced strategic consultant brought in to save his bleeding firm. To me, he was the ghost that had haunted my ambition since I was 22. 10 years ago, the air in this building had felt different. It felt like oxygen I wasn't worthy of breathing. I remember my cheap suit, polyester blend, slightly too large in the shoulders, and the way my hand shook as I handed him my resume. Julian hadn't even invited me to sit. He had leaned back, his eyes scanning my credentials with the bored indifference of a man looking at a grocery receipt. "You have spirit, Elias," he had said, though his tone suggested that spirit was a defect. "But look at this. Your GPA is fine, but your experience? Non-existent. Your skills? Average at best. We are a shark tank. We don't have the time or the charity to be an aquarium for goldfish. You simply aren't remarkable." He didn't look up when he dismissed me. He just slid the resume back across the desk. That sliding sound, the friction of paper against polished wood, had been the soundtrack of my nightmares for months. I walked out of that office feeling like a ghost. I was a senior with honors, a first-generation graduate, and in 30 seconds, a man in a bespoke suit had reduced my entire existence to average. That night, I didn't cry. I sat on the floor of my tiny studio apartment, watching the neon sign of a laundromat flicker outside. A cold, hard knot formed in my chest. It wasn't hate. Hate is hot, it burns out. This was something different. It was a silent, architectural resolve. I decided then that I would never give anyone the power to define my worth again. I didn't apply for another corporate job the next day. I realized Julian was right about one thing: I was a goldfish. And if I stayed in the traditional lanes, I would always be at the mercy of the sharks. I started small. I became a digital ghost. I took on freelance projects that others found too tedious or too complex. While my peers were posting photos of their first corporate happy hours, I was staring at datasets at 3 a.m. I lived on coffee and the intoxicating thrill of solving problems. Every dollar I earned didn't go toward a better car or a nicer apartment. It went into the fund. I bought access to elite masterclasses. I hired speech coaches to strip the stutter from my nerves. I studied marketing psychology, not just to sell products, but to understand the levers of human influence. I spent 3 years in what I call the tunnel. It was a period of absolute focus. I realized that the world doesn't pay for effort, it pays for rarity. I stopped trying to be good and started trying to be the only. I taught myself to synthesize data into narratives. I learned how to read a balance sheet and see the human fear hidden between the margins. By year 5, I wasn't Elias Vance, the rejected applicant. I was Vance, the strategist. I moved from Charlotte to London, then to New York. I built a reputation for being the man you call when the house is on fire, but you don't want the neighbors to see the smoke. I learned that true power isn't loud. It doesn't need to bark. True power is being the person in the room who knows exactly how the clock works while everyone else is just looking at the time. Now, 5 years after my New York stint, I was back in the very room where the goldfish had been discarded. Julian Thorne pushed a folder toward me. The same dry, sliding sound. "Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice now laced with a desperate kind of respect. "We've seen your work with the Meridian Group. We're facing a bit of a structural misalignment. We need your eyes on this." I didn't smile. I didn't reveal the fire in my belly. I just looked at the folder. Then I looked at him. "I don't look at misalignments, Julian," I said softly, using his first name for the first time. The slight flinch in his eyes told me he felt the shift in gravity. "I look at foundations. And from what I see, your foundation is cracked." The meeting was just beginning. Julian Thorne did not recognize me, And that was my first victory. When you spend a decade restructuring yourself, from the DNA of your mindset to the way you tie your silk tie, you don't just change your appearance, you change your frequency. Julian was still looking for the timid student with slumped shoulders from 10 years ago, the boy he could crush with a single smirk. He didn't know how to handle the man sitting before him, a silent, poised entity who possessed the very knowledge he was desperate for to save his legacy. A crack in the foundation? Julian repeated, trying to regain his usual composure. Mr. Vance, we are talking about $1 billion firm. We are merely experiencing a minor liquidity crunch due to market volatility. I opened the leather-bound folder. The sound of paper rustling in the silent boardroom felt like a knife being sharpened. Market volatility is a euphemism for a lack of vision, Julian. You're trying to fill a hole with an even deeper hole. This bridge loan you're eyeing from the Chicago group. Do you know Paul Henderson? Julian's expression shifted for a fraction of a second, a tiny fissure in his mask of complacency. I know the name. Paul isn't just a lender, I said, my eyes fixed on the numbers. He's a scavenger. If you sign this agreement without a concrete exit strategy, within 6 months, the name Sterling & Associates will be nothing more than a footnote in his bankruptcy acquisition report. Silence filled the room. I could feel the panic beginning to leak from his pores. This is the power of truth. It doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be revealed at the precise moment. Watching Julian now, I remembered my second year in the tunnel. It was my darkest period. I had spent every cent of my meager savings on an intensive risk analysis course and was living on ramen in an apartment where the heat frequently failed. My first major project was consulting for an industrial scrapyard on the brink of closure. The owner was a man named Silas, crude, practical, and with no time for fancy terminology. Why should I listen to a kid who's never held a wrench? Silas had asked me. I didn't argue. Instead, I spent 3 days observing his operation. I realized he was losing money not because of a lack of customers, but because he didn't understand the hidden value in the junk. He sold everything by weight, while there were vintage engine components that, if separated and sold to restorers, were worth 10 times the scrap value. I presented him with a handwritten data analysis. You're sitting on a gold mine, but you're treating it like trash. Silas looked at me for a long time, then handed me a check. It was the first money I earned using nothing but my brain. The lesson from Silas was the most important one. Value isn't in what people see, it's in what people understand. I began to apply that to myself. Every time I felt bruised by a rejection, I asked, is this scrap metal or a rare component in the wrong place? I learned to separate emotion from fact, just as Silas separated copper from steel. By year 6, I had moved to New York. That was where I learned that true revenge isn't about making your enemy suffer, it's about making them irrelevant. I had a mentor on Wall Street, a woman named Elena. She was legendary for being the coldest person in finance. Once, when I complained about a competitor trying to smear my reputation, Elena set her teacup down and said, Elias, have you ever seen a lion look back when a dog barks? A lion doesn't need to prove it's a lion. It simply exists. If you spend energy responding, you are admitting they are important enough to bother you. She taught me about the architecture of silence. In a negotiation, the person who speaks the most is usually the weakest. The one who remains silent, observing and waiting, holds the power. Because in the silence, the opponent will inevitably reveal their own fears. I began to practice that stillness. I attended the most high-pressure meetings without ever changing my expression. I learned to control my heart rate through my breath. I wanted to be a mirror. People looked at me and saw only their own reflections, while I saw directly into their souls. In the lonely nights in Manhattan, I often thought of Julian Thorne. Not with hatred, but like an architect looking at a flawed blueprint. I knew that one day, fate would bring me back to Charlotte. Not for a confrontation, but to complete a cycle. Back in the present, In the boardroom of Sterling and Associates, Julian began to pace the room. His arrogance was being replaced by a clumsy restlessness. "What do you want, Vance?" he asked, stopping by the window overlooking the city. "You didn't come here just to lecture me on risk. Do you want a higher fee? Or do you want a seat on the board?" I closed the folder. "I don't want your money, Julian. And I certainly don't want a seat on a sinking ship." I stood up, adjusting my silver cufflinks, a keepsake from my grandfather Walter. "I am here because I promised my investors that I would protect their interests. And currently, their interests are tied to salvaging what's left of this firm." I walked toward him. The distance between us was now only a few feet. Julian flinched slightly, an involuntary reflex. "You were right about one thing 10 years ago," I said, my voice low and steady. "I was a goldfish. But you forgot one thing. Humans have the capacity to evolve. You, Julian, have stayed in the same place. You're still using old tricks for a new world." I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time, a flicker of recognition appeared in the depths of his pupils. A vague fear, a forgotten memory trying to break the surface. Have we met before?" he stammered. I smiled, a professional smile with no warmth. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that tomorrow at 8 a.m., I will present a full restructuring plan to the board. You can choose to walk with me and keep a shred of your dignity, or you can choose to go down with the wreckage." I walked out of the boardroom without waiting for an answer. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was rhythmic and resolute. I didn't feel smug. I felt free. The real battle was just beginning, but this time, I was the one writing the rules. I spent the night in a hotel room overlooking the city, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I laid out my grandfather's silver card on the nightstand. It was a reminder that while Julian inherited a name, I had earned a legacy. I reviewed the files one last time. Julian's firm was more than just misaligned. He had been funneling capital into a passion project, a luxury waterfront development that was hemorrhaging cash. To cover the losses, he had manipulated internal audits. It was a classic sunk cost fallacy, driven by an ego that refused to admit failure. I wasn't just going to save the company. I was going to dismantle the culture of arrogance that allowed it to rot. 8 Uhr morgens. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and anxiety. 7 board members sat around the table. They were the titans of Charlotte's elite, men and women who had known Julian's father and tolerated Julian's incompetence out of loyalty to a dead man. Julian sat at the head of the table, his knuckles white as he gripped a gold pen. When I walked in, the room went silent. "Members of the board," Julian began, his voice slightly too high. "Mr. Vance is here to present a radical view of our current situation. I must remind you that his firm is an outside contractor." I didn't wait for him to finish. I stood at the foot of the table and opened my laptop. "I'm not here to offer a view, Julian. I'm here to offer a survival guide. Because as of midnight, Paul Henderson's group has officially triggered the bad boy clause in your debt agreement. You are, for all intents and purposes, 48 hours away from a hostile takeover." The next hour was a masterclass in surgical precision. I didn't use jargon. I used truth. I showed them the inflated valuations, the ghost tenants in the waterfront project, and the predatory terms of the Chicago loan. One by one, the board members turned their gaze from me to Julian. The loyalty in the room was evaporating. "Julian, is this true?" asked Mrs. Gable, the eldest member and a longtime friend of the Sterling family. Julian stammered. It's a matter of perspective. We were expecting the market to." "The market doesn't care about your expectations," I interrupted. "It only cares about collateral. And right now, you have none." This was the moment of maximum danger. If I pushed too hard, they might close ranks. I had to offer them a way out that didn't involve total ruin. "There is a solution," I said, dimming the lights. A private equity group is willing to inject the necessary capital to pay off Henderson. But it comes with conditions. Total transparency, a complete suspension of the waterfront project, and a new oversight committee with veto power over all capital expenditures. Who is this group? Julian demanded. The Summit Heritage Trust, I replied. Julian froze. He knew the name. It was the trust his father had helped establish, but could never fully control. He didn't know that the primary beneficiary was the man sitting across from him. After the meeting adjourned for a break, I found Julian on the balcony. He looked smaller than he had 10 years ago. The sun was bright, but he looked gray. "Why are you doing this, Vance?" he asked, not looking at me. "Why save me?" "I'm not saving you, Julian," I said, leaning against the railing. "I'm saving the thousands of employees who have their pensions tied to this firm. I'm saving the legacy of a man who actually knew how to build things." "You hate me," he whispered. "No," I said, and I realized I meant it. To hate you, I would have to value your opinion. I haven't valued your opinion since the day you told me I was average. You didn't break me, Julian. You just gave me a reason to build a better version of myself. Paul Henderson arrived at 2 p.m. He was exactly as Elena had described the scavengers of New York, shark-eyed, wearing a smile that didn't reach his face. He expected a surrender. "I assume we're here to sign the transfer papers?" Henderson said, tossing a thick document onto the table. "Actually, Paul," I said, sliding a much thinner envelope toward him. "We're here to discuss the illegal interest rate caps your firm applied to the secondary bridge loan. My team has spent the last 48 hours digging into your Chicago filings. You've breached 3 federal usury laws." Henderson's smile vanished. "You're bluffing." "I don't bluff," I said. "I risk manage. Take the payout for the principal plus 3%, or we file the complaint with the SEC before the market closes." Henderson left 20 minutes later, his face flushed with rage. He took the check. The threat of the takeover was gone. The board voted unanimously to accept the restructuring plan. Julian was allowed to keep his title for appearances, but he was effectively a figurehead. I was the one holding the keys. As the board members filed out, shaking my hand and offering their cards, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. The goal I had chased for a decade was achieved. The goldfish had eaten the shark. I drove back to the old scrapyard that weekend. Silas was gone. He had passed away 3 years prior, but the yard was still there, now run by his son. I stood among the rusted metal and breathed in the scent of iron and oil. This was where the man I was today was forged. I realized that the boardroom in Charlotte was just another kind of scrapyard. People were discarded because they were seen as junk, when they were actually rare components waiting for the right engineer. I sat in my car and looked at the silver card. It was no longer tarnished. I had polished it until it gleamed. I finally understood my grandfather's final lesson. Power isn't about having the most money. It's about having the most options. The card wasn't just a bank account. It was a symbol of autonomy. He knew that the world would try to box me in, and he gave me the tool to cut my way out. A week later, Julian called me to his office. He had been drinking. The room smelled of expensive scotch and regret. "I remembered," he said, his voice slurred. "Last night. I found the old recruitment logs from 10 years ago. Elias Vance. You were that kid from the state school." "I was," I said. "I was a bastard to you," he laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "I was a bastard to everyone. I thought that was what it meant to be powerful, making people feel small." "It's a common mistake," I said. "But true power is making people feel capable. That's why you're losing your company, and I'm taking it over." I didn't stay at Sterling and Associates. Once the restructuring was stable, I handed the reins to a capable CO I had recruited from Elena's firm in New York. I didn't need to be the king of someone else's castle. I had my own. I started a new venture, the Goldfish Incubator. A venture capital firm dedicated to funding the unremarkable candidates, the ones with the wrong degrees, the wrong suits, but the right fire in their eyes. I visited my parents' grave, not the Caldwells from the story, but the memories of who I wanted them to be. I let go of the need for an apology that would never come. Forgiveness isn't for the person who hurt you, it's for yourself. It's the final step in the architecture of silence. When you no longer need their validation, they lose their power over you forever. My phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. Elias, a woman's voice said. It was Elena. I heard about Henderson. Clean work. But the sharks in London are hearing about your new incubator. They think you're soft. Let them think that, I said, looking out at the Charlotte skyline. It's always better to be underestimated. Come to London, she said. The next game is bigger. I stood on the tarmac, watching the private jet refuel. 10 years ago, I couldn't afford a bus ticket to the next city. Today, the world was small. I looked at my reflection in the window of the plane. I saw the man I had become. I wasn't cold, but I was firm. I wasn't arrogant, but I was certain. I had learned that the most powerful thing you can do is to remain calm when everyone else is screaming. To be the silence in the middle of the noise. As the jet took off, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. Success is the only noise I ever need to make. London greeted me with a persistent drizzle and the smell of ancient stone and diesel. If Charlotte was a game of checkers, London was a grandmaster's chess match played in a room full of mirrors. I checked into a hotel in Mayfair. The luxury here wasn't loud. It was ingrained in the heavy velvet curtains and the muffled silence of the hallways. Elena had arranged a meeting for the following evening at an exclusive club in St. James. Don't wear the Charlotte suit, she had texted. London doesn't care about your bank balance. They care about your composure. The club was lit by dim amber lamps and filled with a low hum of voices that decided the fate of national economies. Elena was waiting in a corner booth, looking like a queen regent in a charcoal silk dress. Elias, she said, her eyes tracing the evolution in my face. You look less like a man with a grudge and more like a man with a map. I've stopped looking at the ghosts behind me, I replied, sitting down. I'm looking at the terrain ahead. She nodded toward a group of men by the bar. Those are the Sterling Vaughan partners. They've heard you're a disruptor. In London, disruptor is another word for threat. They're going to test your foundations tonight. One of the partners, a man named Alastair Heath with silver hair and a voice like gravel over silk, approached our table. He didn't offer a hand. He offered a challenge. Mr. Vance, Alastair said, swirling a glass of vintage port. We heard you made quite a splash in the colonies. Salvaging a sinking ship like Sterling and Associates. Noble, but perhaps a bit parochial. Why bother with small-town egos when there's a world to buy? I didn't blink. I didn't defend Charlotte. I don't salvage ships for the nobility of it, Mr. Heath. I do it because I enjoy seeing what others missed. Arrogance is the best cloaking device for opportunity. You'd be surprised what people leave behind when they think they're too big to fail. Alastair's eyes sharpened. For the first time, he actually looked at me. The following weeks were a whirlwind of high-stakes negotiations. My Goldfish Incubator was gaining traction, but it had attracted a predator. A massive venture capital firm, Apex Global, was systematically outbidding us on every underdog startup we scouted. It was targeted. It was personal. I spent 3 nights analyzing Apex's leadership. At the top was a man named Marcus Thorne, Julian's cousin. The family hadn't forgotten. They had just moved to a bigger pond. Marcus Thorne was everything Julian wasn't: disciplined, brilliant, and utterly devoid of empathy. He didn't want to humiliate me. He wanted to erase my presence from the market. He's using his liquidity to starve you out, Elena warned me over lunch at the Wolseley. He can lose money longer than you can stay solvent. He thinks he's playing a game of attrition, I said, sketching a diagram on a napkin. But he's forgot the architecture of silence. He's making too much noise with his bids. He's telling me exactly what he's afraid of. I realized Marcus wasn't bidding on the startups because he valued them. He was bidding on them because I did. He was using me as his unpaid research department. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I began leaking interest in a series of high-risk, fundamentally flawed tech firms. I made sure my scouts were seen in the right London cafes, talking loudly about the next revolutionary AI that was, in reality, a house of cards. Marcus took the bait. Apex Global began pouring millions into these hollow shells, convinced they were stealing the next goldfish from under my nose. I stayed silent. I didn't counterbid. I didn't complain to the press. I let the market believe I was being defeated. Julian even sent me a gloating email. Family always wins in the end, Elias. I didn't reply. I was busy securing the real prize. While Marcus was distracted by the decoys, I used the Summit Heritage Trust to quietly acquire a distressed fiber optic infrastructure company that Apex Global relied on for its high-frequency trading. They had overlooked it because it was boring. It wasn't remarkable. It was exactly the kind of component my grandfather Walter would have told me to watch. By the time Marcus realized he had spent $50 million on junk, I owned the very ground his empire stood on. The meeting at Apex Global's headquarters was a mirror of the one in Charlotte, but the stakes were 10 times higher. Marcus Thorne sat across from me, his face a mask of cold fury. "You think you're clever, Vance?" Marcus spat. "Buying a utility firm? We'll just build our own." "You could," I said, leaning back in the ergonomic chair. "In 5 years. But your investors expect returns this quarter. And right now, I'm increasing your data transit fees by 400%. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss a merger." The merger wasn't a marriage. It was a surrender. Apex Global absorbed the Goldfish Incubator, but I took the position of Chief Strategy Officer with full veto power over their tech portfolio. Marcus Thorne was relegated to administrative duties. The Thorne family legacy was now being managed by the man they had once called a mid-level clerk. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind him of Julian. I simply went to work. Walking through the streets of London one evening, I caught a whiff of peppermint and old books from a small antique shop. I stopped dead. I walked inside and found a first edition ledger from the 1920s. I bought it and sat in a nearby park. I thought about Walter. He had never seen London, but his philosophy had conquered it. "Check the truth," I whispered to the cold air. The truth was that power wasn't about winning. It was about the strength to endure. As CSO of Apex Vance, I began implementing the Goldfish Protocol. We stopped looking for the sharks. We started looking for the people who had been told they weren't enough. Our success rate tripled. The market began to realize that the most remarkable things are often the ones that start out the most average. I wasn't just a consultant anymore. I was a kingmaker. A letter arrived at my London office. It was from Mara. "Julian Thorne has retired to a quiet life in the country," she wrote. "He's selling the estate in Charlotte. He asked if you wanted to buy it. He said it belongs to someone who knows the foundation." I thought about the expensive prison. I thought about the girl who stood on that porch with a deactivated phone. I wrote back, "Tell him to turn it into an art school for underprivileged kids. I'll fund the endowment. I have no interest in living in a mausoleum." Elena came to my office on my last day in London before my trip to Tokyo. She looked at the bare walls, the lack of trophies or photos. "You still haven't filled your space with your ego, Elias," she remarked. "A full room has no space for new ideas," I said. "I like the silence. It keeps me sharp." "You've done it," she said, her voice unusually soft. "You've reached the point where you don't even need to be the silence. You just are." I stood on the balcony of my London penthouse, looking at the Thames. The rain had stopped, and the city lights were reflecting in the dark water. 10 years. 10 years from a no to a global empire. I realized that the most dangerous person in the world isn't the one who has everything. It's the one who knows they can survive with nothing. My parents had tried to erase me, and in doing so, they had made me indelible. I opened my new notebook. The first page was blank. I picked up my pen and wrote, "The art of becoming is never finished. It is only refined." Tokyo was a symphony of contradictions. Shinto shrines tucked between skyscrapers, and the frantic energy of Shibuya crossing balanced by the absolute stillness of a tea ceremony. I arrived not as a conqueror, but as a student. My goal in Tokyo was to finalize a partnership with Saito Heavy Industries, a family-led conglomerate that had survived for 300 years. They didn't care about my London merger or my New York reputation. They cared about harmony. The Americans come here with spreadsheets, Elena had warned me. The British come with contracts. If you want Saito, you must come with a soul. Kenji Saito, the patriarch, was 80 years old and possessed eyes that seemed to see through bone. Our first meeting wasn't in a boardroom, it was in a rock garden in Kyoto. We sat in silence for 40 minutes. Most businessmen would have fidgeted, checked their phones, or tried to fill the void with small talk. I simply watched the raked gravel. I breathed in the smell of damp moss. "You do not fear the emptiness, Vance-san," Saito said finally. His voice was like dry parchment. "Emptiness is where the potential lies," I replied in Japanese. "A cup is only useful because of the space inside it." While I was in Japan, news reached me from the States. My biological parents, the Caldwells, had filed for bankruptcy. The fraudulent loan I had refused to sign years ago had finally caught up with them. The bank I once worked for was suing them for asset inflation. Their names were being dragged through the very mud they had tried to splash on me. I felt no joy. I felt no pity. It was simply the physics of a poorly built foundation finally collapsing under the weight of its own lies. Julian Thorne sent me a final message from his rural retreat. It wasn't a request for money. It was a request for a conversation. I called him from a balcony overlooking the Shinjuku skyline. "Elias," he said, his voice sounding older, thinner. "I watched the news. My family is gone. I'm the last one left with the name, and I'm hiding in a cottage. You won." I just wanted to say it out loud. "It was never a race, Julian," I said softly. "You were running against me, but I was only running against the person I was yesterday. I didn't win because you lost. I won because I stopped needing you to lose." The partnership with Saito Heavy Industries was signed not with a grand ceremony, but with a quiet exchange of ink-brushed signatures. We created the Heritage Fund. It was a global initiative to protect small, essential businesses from predatory takeovers. It was the Goldfish Protocol on a sovereign scale. Saito-san looked at me as we finished. "You have achieved much, Vance-san. But remember, the tallest bamboo is the one that bows lowest in the wind." Before returning to London, I made a secret trip back to Charlotte. I stood at the end of the driveway of the old Caldwell estate. Construction crews were there. The expensive prison was being gutted. The mahogany dining table where my life was erased was likely being sold for scrap. I walked up to the porch where I once stood with a deactivated phone. A young worker looked at me. "Can I help you, sir?" "No," I said, smiling. "I'm just checking the foundation. It looks much stronger now." Back in London, I realized my role had shifted again. I was no longer the strategist, I was the architect. I began spending my mornings meeting with the goldfish we had funded. I told them my story, not the version in the newspapers, but the version of the boy who felt small. "Your power isn't in your bank account," I told a young woman from a council estate who had designed a revolutionary water filtration system. "It's in the fact that they don't see you coming." Apex Vance was now a name that carried more weight than Sterling and Associates ever dreamed of. But I kept my office in the same quiet building in London.
No brass plaque.
No gold leaf letters. True power is invisible. It is the air that people breathe without noticing. It is the infrastructure of the world. Elena retired to a villa in Italy. Her parting gift to me was a vintage compass. "So you never forget which way is forward," she wrote. I visited my grandfather's grave one last time. I brought a sprig of peppermint. "The wolves came, Grandpa," I whispered to the wind. "But they found a lion." I left the silver card on the headstone for a moment, then picked it up. It had served its purpose. It was no longer an escape hatch. It was a medal. I realized that the silent power wasn't about business at all. It was about the internal landscape. If you are at peace with yourself, the world cannot touch you. If you know your own value, no one can devalue you. The dinner course where I was erased was actually the moment I was born. My parents didn't evict me, they set me free. I was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum. I didn't talk about ROI or market share. I talked about the human variable. "We are obsessed with the remarkable," I told the room of world leaders. But the remarkable is brittle. It breaks under pressure. The average, the overlooked, the resilient, that is where the future is built. The room was silent. For the first time, I didn't need to use the architecture of silence. The silence belonged to them. I opened Walter's old ledger in my London study. I turned to the last page. I wrote, Emery Elias Vance. Net worth, immeasurable. Debt, 0. Legacy, integrated. I realized I had finally stopped counting calories and weighing words. My affection was no longer conditional. I had become the man my grandfather knew I could be. The rain returned to London, but this time it felt like a cleansing. I walked through Hyde Park without an umbrella, feeling the cool water on my face. I was 43. I had lived 100 lives in 2 decades. I saw a young man sitting on a bench, looking at a rejection letter. He looked like he wanted to disappear. I stopped and sat next to him. "It's not a no," I said quietly. "It's just a detour." My name is Elias Vance. I was erased from a life I didn't belong in so I could build a world I did. The silver card is in a frame now, hanging in the hall of the art school in Charlotte. It's the first thing the students see when they enter. Underneath it is a plaque that reads, "For those who were told they were nothing, you are the foundation." I stand on the balcony of my life. The horizon is vast and filled with light. The wolves are gone. The sharks are quiet. The goldfish have inherited the ocean. I close my eyes and listen to the silence. It is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. It is the sound of a man who no longer needs to prove he exists. I am Elias Vance. And I am remarkably, perfectly, average.